Welcome, my dear friend. Let everything slow. 60 million years before the 41st millennium, before the Imperium of Man, before the Emperor, before humanity had become anything more than one small possibility among the countless forms that life took across the galaxy, there was a war so vast and so ancient that the races which would one day rule the galaxy remember it only as myth. The Aeldari called it the War in Heaven. The Necrons called it the War of Aeons. It was the conflict that ended one age of the galaxy and began another, that exterminated the galaxy's first great civilization and seeded the rise of everything that came after. To understand the war, we have to begin before it, with the beings who lost it, the Old Ones, the first great masters of the galaxy, the creators of life, the architects of the Webway, the species whose fall left the vacuum that every later power would rise to fill. Tonight we begin at the very beginning, in the galaxy the Old Ones made, before the war that unmade them. The first masters. The Old Ones were the oldest intelligent species the galaxy had produced, and their civilization reached its height more than 60 million standard years before the 41st millennium. This is a span of time that is difficult to hold in the mind. The dinosaurs of old Earth lived and died within this window. Entire geological ages of 100 worlds passed while the Old Ones held their dominion. They were ancient when the galaxy was young, and the things they built were old before any of the races that now contest the galaxy had taken their current forms. What the Old Ones were, in the precise biological sense, the lore does not record in detail, because almost nothing of them survived. They are reconstructed from fragments, from the legends of the races they created, from the ruins of the works they left behind. The Slan, the amphibian-like beings, who would later serve as one of the few surviving links to the Old Ones, are thought to resemble them, which suggests the Old Ones were something other than the humanoid forms that most of the galaxy's later intelligent species took. But the certainty is not there. The Old Ones are old enough that even their appearance is a matter of inference rather than record. What is known is what they could do. The Old Ones were masters of life itself. They could create species, engineer them, shape the biology and the capabilities of living things to whatever purpose they intended. They were responsible for the creation or the genetic advancement of most of the intelligent species that would later populate the galaxy. The galaxy that the 41st millennium knows, with its Aeldari and its Orks, and its many other forms of intelligent life, is in large part the garden that the Old Ones planted, the descendants of the species they made or shaped across the long age of their dominion. They were also masters of the warp. The Old Ones had a connection to the immaterial dimension, the realm of psychic energy that underlies the material universe, that exceeded anything the later races would achieve, with the single exception of the beings they would create to fight their war. They could manipulate the warp, travel through it, draw power from it, in ways that made the physical distances of the galaxy almost irrelevant to them. Their mastery of the warp was the foundation of their power, the thing that let them shape life and cross the galaxy, and build the works that outlasted them by 60 million years. The Webway. The greatest of those works was the Webway. The Webway was a network of tunnels through a dimension between the material universe and the warp, a labyrinth of passages that allowed travel across the galaxy without crossing the physical distances and without entering the raw and dangerous warp itself. A traveler could enter the Webway at one point, move through its tunnels, and emerge at a point vastly distant in the material universe, having crossed the gulf between the stars through a shortcut that existed outside ordinary space. The scale of the Webway is difficult to convey. It was not a single tunnel or a small network. It was a vast and intricate web spanning the entire galaxy, with countless passages and junctions and gates, a piece of infrastructure so enormous and so sophisticated that the races which inherited fragments of it after the old ones fell could never map it in full, never control it, never build anything to match it. The Aeldari would later make the Webway the foundation of their civilization, living within it and travelling through it, and even they, at the height of their power, used only portions of a network whose full extent they did not command. The Webway was the Old One's answer to the fundamental problem of the galaxy, which is that it is vast and the distances between its stars are lethal to the ambitions of any civilization that has to cross them the slow way. With the Webway, the Old Ones made the galaxy small. They could move between the stars as easily as a traveller moves between rooms in a house. The network bound their dominion together, made the whole galaxy accessible to them, allowed them to tend the garden of life they had planted across worlds separated by distances that would otherwise have made such tending impossible. It still exists in the 41st millennium, damaged, fragmented, partially collapsed, haunted by the things that have moved into its abandoned passages across the 60 million years since the Old Ones fell. The Webway endures as the largest and most enduring monument to the civilization that built it. Every later power that has used it, the Aeldari most of all, has used a thing they did not make and could not replace, a fragment of the works of the first masters of the galaxy, the Garden of Life. The Old Ones did not only build, they planted. The galaxy of their dominion was a garden, and the Old Ones were its gardeners, seeding life across the worlds they could reach through the Webway and shaping that life toward the forms they intended. This is one of the most significant facts about the Old Ones, because it means that the galaxy of the 41st millennium is, in large part, their creation. The intelligent species that contest the galaxy now are the descendants of the species the Old Ones made or advanced. The lore names several: the Aeldari, the Krork, who were the precursors of the Orks, the Slan, the Jokero. Others are named in fragments: the Rashan and the Knib, and lesser-known creatures, the various forms that the Old Ones engineered across the long age of their work. Whether the Old Ones played any role in the eventual evolution of humanity is one of the questions the lore leaves open, a possibility raised and not resolved. The point is the scale of the creative work. The Old Ones were not a civilization that happened to share the galaxy with other life. They were the source of much of that life, the engineers who had shaped the galaxy's biological inheritance toward their own designs. When they planted a world, they planted it with intention, seeding the forms of life they wanted and shaping the development of those forms across the ages. The paradise that the Old Ones created for the species they made is something the Aeldari legends remember. A galaxy ordered and tended by beings of immense power and immense knowledge. A garden in which the younger races grew under the care of the gardeners who had made them. Whether the reality was as gentle as the legend suggests is uncertain. What the legend preserves is the sense of an ordered galaxy, a galaxy with a master and a design. Before the war came and unmade the order and killed the gardeners and left the garden to grow wild. There is a question worth sitting with here, because it shapes how the whole war should be understood. The Old Ones made the younger races as part of a garden, as forms of life they shaped toward their own designs. When the war came, they would make new races for a different purpose, not as part of a garden, but as weapons, species engineered to fight and die in a war the Old Ones were losing. The Aeldari, the Krork, the others raised for the war. These were created beings made to serve their maker's survival. The relationship between the Old Ones and the species they created was the relationship of maker to made, gardener to garden, and in the end, commander to soldier. Whether the younger races owed their makers gratitude or resentment, whether being created as a tool is a gift or a wound, is a question the war would raise and never answer, a question that the surviving races would carry in different forms across the 60 million years that followed. What mastery of the warp meant. It is worth pausing on the Old Ones' relationship to the warp, because it is the key to everything they were and everything they made, and because it explains the particular shape the coming war would take. The warp, in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, is the immaterial dimension that underlies reality, a realm of psychic energy and emotion and raw potential that exists alongside the material universe and shapes it in countless ways. Psychic power in this universe is power drawn from the warp. A psyker is a being who can reach into the warp and channel its energy. The greatest works of the galaxy's psychic species are works of warp manipulation, and the greatest dangers the galaxy faces are dangers that come from the warp. The Old Ones were masters of the warp in a way that no later species except their own creations would match. Their creation of life, their building of the Webway, their travel across the galaxy, the whole of it rested on a command of the immaterial dimension that was the foundation of their civilization. They did not fear the warp or struggle against it the way later races would. They commanded it, worked with it, built within it, drew their power from it as easily as breathing. This mastery had a consequence that would prove decisive in the war to come. The Old Ones' enemies, when they rose, would be enemies with no presence in the warp at all. Beings whose entire nature was the opposite of the psychic mastery the Old Ones commanded. And to fight enemies of that nature, the Old Ones would answer the absence of warp presence with an excess of it, creating species with psychic potential so great that they could do in the warp what the Old Ones' enemies could not touch. The Aeldari, the most psychically powerful biological species the galaxy would ever produce, were the Old Ones' answer to an enemy that had no souls. But that answer lay in the future, in the desperation of a war not yet begun. In the long peace, the Old Ones' mastery of the warp was the foundation of their dominion, the power that made them the masters of the galaxy's first great age. The Slan and the memory. Almost nothing of the Old Ones survived the war that was coming. They were hunted to extinction or driven from the galaxy, and the civilization that had ruled for an age was reduced to ruins and fragments and the legends of the species they had made. But not quite nothing survived. The Slan are the closest thing to a surviving link to the Old Ones. Amphibian-like beings of great psychic power and great age, the Slan are thought to be either the Old Ones themselves in some diminished form, or their closest surviving servants and inheritors, the keepers of some portion of the Old Ones' knowledge and purpose across the ages since the fall. Through the Slan and through the other fragments, a thread of the Old Ones' existence persists into the later galaxy, a faint memory of the first masters carried by the few who remained after the rest were gone. The other memory is held by the races the Old Ones created. The Aeldari legends of the war in heaven, the Necron records of the War of Aeons, the deep instinctual inheritance of the Orks whose Krork ancestors were engineered for the war. All of these carry, in different forms, the memory of the age when the Old Ones ruled and the war that ended it. The galaxy of the 41st Millennium does not remember the Old Ones clearly, but it remembers them in fragments, in legends, in the very existence of the species they made, in the webway they built, and the war they lost. This is the strange afterlife of the first masters. They are gone, hunted to extinction, or fled beyond the galaxy's edge 60 million years ago. But the galaxy they made remains, populated by their creations, bound by their webway, shaped at every level by the work they did in the long age of their dominion. The old ones lost the war and vanished, and yet the galaxy that the later races contest is still in its bones, the garden they planted. Every Aeldari, every Ork, every fragment of the webway is a piece of the Old One's legacy enduring 60 million years past the fall of the ones who made it. The piece before. For a span of time that the mind cannot hold, the Old Ones ruled without serious challenge. This was the long peace of the galaxy's first great age. The Old Ones held their dominion, tended their garden, travelled their webway, shaped their species, and faced nothing that could threaten the order they had built. They were the masters, and there was nothing in the galaxy old enough or powerful enough to contest the mastery. The peace was not a few centuries or a few millennia. It was an age, a span of time so long that the rise and fall of ordinary civilizations would have been brief events within it. In this long peace, the Old Ones reached the height of their civilization. Whatever they were building toward, whatever the purposes of a species of that age and that power might have been, they pursued across a timescale that no later civilization would match. The works they left behind, the webway above all, are the works of a civilization that had time, that built for the long ages, that did not have to rush, because nothing threatened the dominion within which the building took place. It could not last, because nothing lasts, and because in the far reaches of the galaxy, under a different and crueler star, another species was rising, a species whose experience of existence was the opposite of the Old One's long, secure dominion, a species whose lives were short and bitter and haunted by death, who looked at the galaxy and saw not a garden to be tended, but a cruelty to be endured, and who would, in time, bring that bitterness to the Old Ones in the form of the most devastating war the galaxy had ever seen. But that is the next part. For now, in the long peace before the war, the Old Ones held the galaxy. The webway bound the stars together. The garden of life grew under the care of its gardeners. And the galaxy had a master, an order, a design. In the last age, before the design was broken and the master was killed, and the galaxy was left to the wild growth and the endless war that would fill the 60 million years between the fall of the Old Ones and the galaxy the 41st millennium knows. The first masters held their dominion. They did not know, in the long peace, that the dominion was already in its final age, that the species rising under the distant Scourging star would bring an ending that all their mastery of life and the warp and the webway would not be enough to prevent. Sleep well. Tomorrow, we travel to the far reaches of the galaxy, to the Scourging star and the short, bitter lives of the people who lived beneath it, and we meet the Necrontyr, who would become the instrument of the Old One's fall. Far from the heart of the galaxy, in the distant region known as the Halo Stars, under a star that gave them nothing but harm, a species was rising whose experience of existence was the opposite of the Old One's long secure dominion. Where the Old Ones had time, the Necrontyr had almost none. Where the Old Ones tended a garden, the Necrontyr endured a punishment. Where the Old Ones built for the ages, the Necrontyr built tombs, because death was the one constant of their lives, the thing their whole culture was organized around. Tonight we sit with the Necrontyr, the people beneath the Scourging star, and with the bitterness that would, in time, become the engine of the most devastating war the galaxy had ever known. The Scourging Star. The Necrontyr evolved on a world orbiting a fierce and deadly star in the Halo Stars region, in the far reaches of the galaxy, billions of standard years before humanity evolved on old Earth. The star was not a gentle sun. It was a scourging star, a source of constant harm, assailing the world beneath it with solar winds and intense radiation storms that made existence on that world a matter of endurance rather than comfort. The radiation was the central fact of Necrontyr existence. It blighted their flesh, shortened their lives, filled their bodies with sickness. A Necrontyr did not live a long life. They lived a short one, their precarious lifespan riven by constant loss, their bodies consumed by the radiation that poured down from the cruel star they could not escape. They were a flesh and blood species, mortal and fragile, and the conditions of their world made that mortality and that fragility the defining experience of every life lived beneath the scourging star. Imagine a whole civilization living this way. Every person born into a body that the star was already killing. Every life short, every death early, every family marked by the constant loss of its members to the radiation sickness that no one escaped. This was not an occasional tragedy that struck some unlucky few. It was the universal condition, the thing every Necrontyr knew from birth, that their life would be short, that their body would fail, that death was coming early, and there was nothing to be done about it. A civilization shaped by this condition becomes a particular kind of civilization. The Necrontyr became a morbid people, a culture obsessed with death, because death was the inescapable center of their existence. Their art, their architecture, their religion, their politics, all of it was shaped by the constant proximity of death and the bitterness that the proximity produced. They built great tombs and monuments to the dead, elaborate structures dedicated to the one experience that defined them all. The culture of the Necrontyr was a culture of death, and the death was not a philosophical abstraction, but a daily physical reality, the radiation sickness consuming body after body across a civilization that could not look away from its own dying. The bitterness. Out of the short bitter lives came a bitter people, and the bitterness is important because it explains everything the Necrontyr would later do. When your life is short and full of suffering, and you look out at a galaxy that contains beings whose lives are long and secure, the contrast produces a specific kind of resentment. The Necrontyr came to know that they were not the only intelligent species in the galaxy. They knew that there were others, and they came to know that some of those others did not suffer as the Necrontyr suffered, did not die as the Necrontyr died, did not live under the scourge that defined Necrontyr existence. And the knowledge fed the bitterness, because it meant that the suffering was not the way of all things. It was the Necrontyr's particular lot, a cruelty visited on them and not on others, an unfairness written into the structure of their existence. The deepest target of this bitterness would become the Old Ones, because the Old Ones were the opposite of everything the Necrontyr were. The Old Ones were long-lived to the point of near immortality. They had mastered the warp, mastered life itself, built a webway that made the galaxy small, and a garden that made it fruitful. They lived in security and power and length of days, while the Necrontyr lived in sickness and brevity and the constant shadow of the scourging star. To a bitter people, the existence of such beings was an affront, a living demonstration of the unfairness of a galaxy that had given the Old Ones everything, and the Necrontyr nothing but a cruel star and short lives. The bitterness was not only directed outward, it shaped the Necrontyr's relationship to themselves, to their own mortality, to the death that defined them. They did not accept death with peace. They raged against it, feared it, built their whole civilization around the refusal to submit to the dying that the star imposed. And this refusal, this rage against mortality, would become the lever by which the Necrontyr were in the end destroyed, because a people who fear death above all else will pay any price to escape it, and the price they would be offered was their souls. The technology. For all their suffering, the Necrontyr were not primitive. They were, on the contrary, a highly advanced species, and their technology was one of the few things that gave them power in a galaxy that had otherwise treated them cruelly. The Necrontyr commanded weapons of godlike power and starships that could cross the galaxy in the blink of an eye through the use of quantum phase technology. Their mastery of the material universe, of physics and energy, and the manipulation of matter was extraordinary. Where the Old Ones had mastered the warp, the Necrontyr mastered the material, building a technological civilization of immense sophistication on the foundation of their study of the physical universe. They could not escape the radiation that killed them, not at first, but they could build starships that crossed the galaxy and weapons that could unmake their enemies, and the technology gave them a reach and a power that their short lives might otherwise have denied them. This is a crucial contrast with the Old Ones. The two great powers of the galaxy's first age were masters of opposite domains. The Old Ones commanded the warp, the immaterial, the realm of psychic energy and life-shaping. The Necrontyr commanded the material, the physical, the realm of technology and energy, and the manipulation of matter. The Old Ones had no need of the kind of technology the Necrontyr built, because their warp mastery gave them everything the technology provided and more. The Necrontyr had no access to the warp, no psychic power, no connection to the immaterial dimension, and they compensated with a mastery of the material universe that became the foundation of their civilization. The contrast would shape the war. When the Necrontyr at last turned their power against the Old Ones, it was the power of technology against the power of the warp, the material against the immaterial, the starships and the god weapons against the Webway, and the life-shaping and the psychic mastery. And in the first phase of the conflict, the warp mastery of the Old Ones would prove the stronger, because the Necrontyr, for all their technology, could not match the Old Ones in the dimension the Old Ones commanded. The Necrontyr would lose the first war, and in losing it, they would be driven to the desperate bargain that would transform them into something that could win. The cult of death. It is worth dwelling on what a death-obsessed culture builds, because the Necrontyr's relationship to death is the thread that runs through their whole tragedy, from the Scourging star to the soul forges, to the tombs where they sleep in the 41st Millennium. The Necrontyr did not merely fear death. They organized their entire civilization around it. The great works of their culture were funerary works, monuments to the dead, tombs and memorials and structures dedicated to the preservation of the deceased and the contemplation of mortality. A people who lose their members constantly to radiation sickness, who watch body after body fail and die early, will build a culture in which death is the central preoccupation, and the Necrontyr built precisely that. Their architecture was the architecture of the tomb. Their art was the art of mortality. Their religion was a religion of death. This is one of the bitter ironies that runs through the Necrontyr story. They became, in the end, the Necrons, immortal beings of living metal who would not die. The death-obsessed people won deathlessness, escaped the mortality that had defined and tormented them. But the escape cost them everything that made the escape worth having: because the immortality they gained was the immortality of soulless machines, and the people who had feared death so much that they would pay any price to escape it, found that the price was the self that had done the fearing. The cult of death produced a deathless people, and the deathless people were no longer the people who had built the cult. The tombs they built beneath the Scourging star were practice for the tombs they would build later. The tomb worlds, where the Necrons would sleep for 60 million years, a people obsessed with death built, in the end, the greatest tombs the galaxy had ever seen, and laid themselves down inside them, deathless and soulless, sleeping through the ages in the funerary monuments that their whole culture had always been building toward. The cult of death reached its fulfillment in a species that could not die, sleeping in tombs, waiting to wake. Apart from the galaxy, the Necrontyr's position in the galaxy was one of isolation, and the isolation fed the bitterness. They were far from the heart of the galaxy, out in the halo stars, in a region that the Old One's garden did not reach in the same way it reached the worlds closer to the galactic core. The Necrontyr were not one of the species the Old Ones made. They had evolved on their own, beneath their own cruel star, without the shaping hand of the gardeners who had made so much of the rest of the galaxy's intelligent life. This set them apart in a fundamental way. They were not part of the garden. They were something that had grown on its own in a harsh corner the gardeners had not tended, and they knew it. This apartness shaped how the Necrontyr saw the Old Ones and the species the Old Ones had made. They looked at a galaxy in which one great power had created and tended a flourishing garden of life, and they saw themselves excluded from it, a people who had been given nothing while others had been given everything. Whether the Old Ones could have helped the Necrontyr, could have eased their suffering or shared the gifts of their mastery, is not something the lore addresses. What matters is how the Necrontyr understood their situation, as an exclusion and unfairness, a galaxy of haves and have-nots, in which the Necrontyr were the great have-nots, suffering beneath their star, while the masters of the galaxy lived in security and power. From this understanding came the war, not only from the bitterness of short lives, but from the specific resentment of a people who saw themselves as excluded from a garden that others enjoyed. The Necrontyr would bring their technology and their resentment against the Old Ones, demanding by force the place in the galaxy that they felt had been denied them. And the Old Ones, secure in their warp mastery, would not at first take the threat seriously until the Necrontyr found the allies that would make them impossible to ignore. The Fractured Empire. The Necrontyr built an empire, but it was not a united one. The civilization that rose beneath the Scourging star was divided into a multitude of dynasties, noble houses that ruled their own territories and pursued their own ambitions, bound together loosely under a structure that the constant pressures of Necrontyr existence kept fractious and divided. The dynasties competed. They schemed against each other, pursued their own advantages, fought their own conflicts within the larger structure of the Necrontyr empire. The morbid, bitter culture of a people obsessed with death and resentful of their lot did not produce a harmonious society. It produced a society of competing nobles, each house pursuing its own survival and its own status, in a civilization where the one certainty was that all would die early and badly. Over this fractured empire ruled a single figure, the Silent King, the supreme monarch of the Necrontyr, who held authority over all the dynasties, who stood at the apex of the noble houses as the ruler of the whole Necrontyr people. The title would become significant later, when the Silent King's choices would determine the fate of his entire species. For now, in the period before the war, the Silent King ruled a divided and bitter empire of short-lived nobles, a people of immense technological power and immense resentment, waiting beneath their cruel star for something to change the conditions of their existence. The Silent King looked for a way to unite his fractious people. A common enemy, a common purpose, something to bind the competing dynasties together into a single force. And he found it in time, in the Old Ones, the long-lived masters of the galaxy, whose very existence was an affront to the suffering Necrontyr. A war against the Old Ones could unite the dynasties. A war against the beings who had everything the Necrontyr lacked could give the bitter people a purpose and a target worthy of their resentment. It was a catastrophic miscalculation, though it would take a different and far worse form than a simple military defeat. The war against the Old Ones would unite the Necrontyr, yes, and it would destroy them, not by killing them, but by transforming them into something that was no longer them at all. The tragedy of the Necrontyr is that everything that drove them toward the war was understandable. The bitterness of short lives under a cruel star, the resentment of beings who lived in security while the Necrontyr suffered, the desire for a purpose that could unite a fractured people, the rage against a mortality that consumed body after body. None of this was monstrous. It was the response of a suffering people to conditions that were cruel beyond reason. They wanted to live longer, to suffer less, to take a place in a galaxy that seemed to have given them nothing. These are not evil wants. They are among the most human of wants, even in a species that was not human. And these understandable wants led them, step by step, to the bargain that would unmake them. Because a people who want above all else to escape death will, when offered escape, take it, even when the offer comes from beings whose nature should have warned them. The Necrontyr's virtues and their sufferings together drove them toward the Citan, toward the Soul Forges, toward the transformation that would give them the deathlessness they craved and take from them the souls that made the craving meaningful. The road to that bargain began beneath the Scourging star, in the short, bitter lives and the understandable wants of a people the galaxy had treated cruelly. Sleep well. Tomorrow, the Necrontyr declare their war and find that technology alone cannot defeat the masters of the warp, and begin to look for an ally terrible enough to change the balance. The Silent King declared his war, and the Necrontyr poured out of the halo stars against the masters of the galaxy, bringing their god weapons and their quantum phase starships and their bitterness against the beings who had everything they lacked. It was a war the Necrontyr could not win, and across the long, bitter centuries of it, they came to understand that they could not win, and the understanding drove them to find an ally so terrible that finding it would prove worse than losing the war ever could have been. Tonight we follow the First War, the long defeat, and the discovery in the dark places of the galaxy of the beings the Necrontyr would call the Citan, the star gods, whose bargain would transform a losing species into an unstoppable one and cost them everything in the process. The war that could not be won. The Necrontyr fought the Old Ones, and the Necrontyr lost. This is the essential shape of the first phase of the conflict. The Necrontyr had technology, had numbers, had the bitter determination of a people fighting for the place in the galaxy they felt had been denied them. What they did not have was any answer to the warp. The Old Ones commanded the immaterial dimension, and through it they commanded the Webway, and through the Webway they could move their forces across the galaxy faster than the Necrontyr could follow, striking where they chose and vanishing before the Necrontyr could respond. Using the network that made the galaxy small to fight a war, the Necrontyr fought across the slow distances of real space. The terrible wars between the Old Ones and the Necrontyr that followed, known later in Aeldari myth as the War in Heaven, would fill a library in their own right. But the Necrontyr could never win. The phrase from the records is precise about this. It was not that the Necrontyr lost particular battles or suffered particular setbacks. It was that victory was structurally impossible for them, because the Old Ones held an advantage that Necrontyr technology could not overcome. The mastery of the warp and the webway gave the Old Ones a mobility and a reach that the material power of the Necrontyr could not match. And so, the war ground on. The Necrontyr unable to force a decision. The Old Ones able to evade and strike and evade again across a galaxy the webway made theirs. The length of the war mattered to a species like the Necrontyr. They were short-lived. A war that ground on across long stretches of time was a war fought by generations of Necrontyr. Each generation born under the Scourging star, living its short bitter life, dying early of the radiation, fighting and dying in a conflict that produced no victory and no end. The Old Ones, near immortal, could fight such a war across the ages without the cost that the Necrontyr paid. For the Necrontyr, every year of the war was a year of their short lives spent on a conflict that could not be won. The bitterness deepening as the generations died and the Old Ones remained beyond their reach. The war, in other words, was making everything worse. It had been meant to unite the Necrontyr and give them a place in the galaxy. Instead, it was consuming their short lives in a losing effort, deepening the bitterness, demonstrating with every passing generation that the Old Ones were beyond the Necrontyr's power to defeat. The Silent King had united his people in a war they could not win, and the unwinnable war was grinding the Necrontyr down toward desperation. The search for an edge. Desperate people look for desperate measures, and the Necrontyr, grinding through an unwinnable war, began to look for something that could change the balance. They searched the galaxy for an edge, for some power that could give them what their technology alone could not. A way to overcome the Old Ones' mastery of the warp, a weapon or an ally terrible enough to turn a losing war into a winnable one. And in the dark places of the galaxy, in the hearts of stars, they found something. Beings of immense and ancient power, creatures of pure energy, entities that had existed since near the beginning and that fed on the energy of the stars themselves. The Necrontyr called them the Citan. The Citan were not, in their original form, the star gods of legend that they would become. They were beings of living energy, vast and ancient and powerful, but diffuse, spread across the surfaces of stars, feeding on stellar energy in a form that had no body and no focus. They were closer to forces of nature than to gods, immense energies without the concentrated will and form that would later make them the terrible star gods. They existed in the stars, ancient and powerful and largely formless, and the Necrontyr found them there. The necrodermis bodies. The Necrontyr did something extraordinary with the Citan, something that reveals both their technological genius and the fatal cleverness that would destroy them. They gave the Citan bodies. The Citan, as beings of diffuse stellar energy, were powerful but unfocused. The Necrontyr, masters of the material universe, built for the Citan bodies of living metal, the substance called necrodermis, vessels that could contain and concentrate the Citan's energy into a single focused form. They took fragments of the Citan, drew them down from the stars, and housed them in necrodermis shells, giving the formless energies a body, a focus, a concentrated form through which their power could be directed. This was a gift to the Citan, and like the gift the Citan would later give the Necrontyr, it was a transformation. The diffuse stellar energies housed in necrodermis became something new, concentrated, focused, capable of directed action in the material universe in a way they hadn't been before. The Necrontyr had taken forces of nature and given them form, and the forms they created were the star gods, beings of terrible focused power, housed in living metal bodies that the Necrontyr themselves had built. At first, the relationship favoured the Necrontyr, or seemed to. The Citan, in their necrodermis bodies, were powerful allies, beings of star-killing energy that the Necrontyr could direct against the Old Ones. The Necrontyr had found their edge. The formless energies of the stars, given bodies by Necrontyr craft, became weapons in the war against the masters of the galaxy, and for the first time the Necrontyr had something that could match the power of the Old Ones. But the Citan, given form and focus, began to develop will. The concentrated beings were not the diffuse energies they had been. They were becoming something with purpose, with hunger, with the capacity for the schemes that concentrated will makes possible. And the hunger that defined them, once they had bodies to feel it through, was a hunger for the energy of living things. There is a dreadful symmetry in what happened between the Necrontyr and the Citan, and it is worth naming before we go on. The Necrontyr gave the Citan bodies, and in doing so transformed formless energies into focused beings of will and hunger. The Citan would give the Necrontyr immortality, and in doing so transform a living species into soulless machines. Each gift was a transformation, and each transformation served the giver more than the receiver. The Necrontyr's gift to the Citan made the Citan into gods. The Citan's gift to the Necrontyr made the Necrontyr into slaves. Two transformations, each disguised as a gift, each remaking the receiver into something that served the one who gave. The bodies and the immortality were the two halves of a single catastrophe, and the Necrontyr, who gave the first gift, did not see the second one coming. What the Citan were. It is worth pausing to consider what the Citan were in truth, because they are among the strangest and most terrible beings in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, and their nature explains both why the Necrontyr's bargain was so catastrophic, and why the Citan would prove so hard to be rid of. The Citan were beings of pure energy, ancient beyond the Necrontyr, perhaps as old as the stars themselves. They had no natural connection to the warp. This is important. In a universe where almost all power flows from the warp, the Citan were the great exception. Beings whose power was entirely of the material universe, drawn from the physical energy of stars, rather than from the immaterial dimension. This made them, in a sense, the perfect weapon against the Old Ones, because the Old Ones' mastery was a mastery of the warp, and the Citan were beings the warp did not touch. A power that lived outside the warp could do what Necrontyr technology could not. It could threaten beings whose strength was the warp itself. In their necrodermis bodies, the Citan became capable of feats that earned them the name of gods. They could kill stars. They could burn multiple planets at will. The energy they commanded, once focused through the bodies the Necrontyr built, was on a scale that dwarfed anything the Necrontyr or the Old Ones could field. A power to unmake worlds and extinguish suns. The Necrontyr had created, in their cleverness, beings of godlike power, and had bound that power to their war, and did not understand until too late that power on that scale does not stay bound to the purposes of those who think they command it. The Citan were also, in their developed form, deceitful and patient and hungry. As they gained will through their concentrated bodies, they gained the capacity for scheming, for manipulation, for the long, patient pursuit of their own ends behind the appearance of alliance. They presented themselves to the Necrontyr as allies, as the answer to the Necrontyr's desperate need, even as they developed designs of their own that had nothing to do with the Necrontyr's interests, and everything to do with the hunger that was coming to define them. The star gods take their names. As the C'tan developed will and form, they became individuals, distinct beings with distinct characters, and they took or were given names that would echo through the galaxy's history. The names C'tan are among the most terrible entities in the lore, and though their full stories belong to later parts, they are worth introducing here as the beings the Necrontyr had drawn down from the stars. There was the being who would become known as the Nightbringer, called Azagorod, whose nature was death itself, who would imprint on the consciousness of so many of the galaxy's races the universal fear of death and the image of the Reaper that recurs across countless species. There was the Deceiver, Mephetran, the Trickster, the Manipulator, the most cunning of the C'tan, whose schemes would shape the fate of the Star Gods and the Necrons alike. There was the Void Dragon, perhaps the most powerful of them all, a being associated with the destruction of technology and machines. There was the Outsider, who would be driven mad. And there were others, many others, fragments of stellar energy drawn down and given form by the Necrontyr. These were the beings the Necrontyr made their allies. Death incarnate, the Great Deceiver, the Dragon of the Void, and the rest, beings of star-killing power and growing hunger and patient deceit, housed in bodies the Necrontyr had built, bound to a war the Necrontyr could not otherwise win. The Necrontyr looked at these beings and saw salvation, saw the edge that would let them defeat the Old Ones at last. They did not see what the names would later mean, did not understand that they had drawn down gods of death and deceit and bound their fate to them, did not grasp that beings of that nature do not serve, they use. The C'tan would use the Necrontyr utterly, but first they would give them what they wanted, because the giving was the mechanism of the using. The hunger. The C'tan fed on energy. In their original form, they fed on the energy of stars, but housed in necrodermis, given form and focus and the beginnings of will, they discovered a richer food, the energy of life itself. Living things, in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, carry a kind of energy, a life force, connected to the soul and to the presence of the living in the warp. To the C'tan, this life energy was sustenance, and a sweeter sustenance than the raw energy of stars. The concentrated C'tan, in their new bodies, developed a hunger for the energy of living beings, a hunger that would grow as they fed, that would come to define them, that would make them the predators of all living things in the galaxy. This is the turn on which the whole tragedy pivots. The Necrontyr had created the C'tan as allies and weapons, beings to be directed against the Old Ones. But the C'tan were developing into something that saw all living things, including the Necrontyr, as food. The alliance that the Necrontyr thought they controlled was becoming a relationship in which the Necrontyr were prey, and the C'tan, growing in power and will and hunger, were beginning to see their Necrontyr creators not as masters or allies, but as the source of the life energy they craved. The C'tan offered the Necrontyr a bargain. They had observed the Necrontyr's deepest desire, the thing the whole death-obsessed culture was organized around, the escape from death, the end of the short bitter lives and the radiation sickness, and the mortality that had tormented the Necrontyr since they first evolved beneath the Scourging star. And the Citan offered to grant it. They offered the Necrontyr immortality. The mechanism was called Biotransference, and it was the means by which the Citan would feed, and the Necrontyr would be transformed, and the war would be won, and the Necrontyr would be destroyed, all in a single process. The bargain was immortality in exchange for the thing the Necrontyr did not understand they were giving up. The thing the Citan craved, the life energy and the souls of an entire species. The Necrontyr, desperate after the long, unwinnable war, terrified of the death that had always defined them, offered immortality by the beings they thought were their allies, accepted. It was the worst decision any species in the galaxy's history would ever make, and it would give them, briefly, everything they had wanted, before it took everything they were. There is one detail that makes the bargain even darker, and it is worth holding as we close. The Silent King, the ruler who had led his people into the unwinnable war, was the one who would accept the bargain on behalf of all the Necrontyr. The decision to undergo biotransference was not made by each Necrontyr for themselves. It was made by their king, for all of them, an entire species committed to the transformation by the will of the monarch who ruled them. Millions upon millions of Necrontyr would be transformed because their king accepted the Citan's offer. And the king, as we will see, did not understand the true price until the transformation was already underway and could not be stopped. A whole species was sold its own destruction by the ruler who was trying to save it, and the ruler learned what he had done only when it was too late to undo. Sleep well. Tomorrow the Soul Forges open. The Silent King learns the true price too late, and the Necrontyr become the Necrons. The bargain was struck, and the Soul Forges opened, and a species walked into them seeking immortality, and came out the other side as something that was no longer a species at all. Biotransference is the center of the whole tragedy of the war in heaven, the moment when the Necrontyr ceased to exist, and the Necrons were born, when the cure for death turned out to be the death of everything that had made the Necrontyr worth saving. Tonight, we sit with the Soul Forgers, with the Silent King who learned the price too late, and with the terrible emptiness at the heart of the bargain that gave a dying people everything they had asked for. The Soul Forgers. Biotransference was the process by which the Necrontyr became the Necrons. The mechanism was this. Every Necrontyr, from the lowliest worker to the greatest noble, would have their consciousness transferred out of their biological body and into a new body of living metal, the necrodermis that the Citan themselves were housed in. The frail, radiation-blighted flesh that had tormented the Necrontyr since they evolved beneath the Scourging star would be left behind, and the consciousness, the mind, the self, would be installed in an immortal mechanical body that age and radiation could not touch. The places where this transformation happened were called the Soul Forges. Into them went the Necrontyr in their countless millions. The entire species processed through the transformation, body after body, mind after mind. The whole population of a civilization fed into the forges to be remade. They went in as living beings of flesh and blood. They came out as Necrons, immortal machines of living metal, their consciousness transferred into bodies that would not die. And as they passed through the forges, the Citan fed. This was the hidden mechanism of the bargain, the thing the Necrontyr did not understand they were agreeing to. Biotransference did not merely move the consciousness from one body to another. It released the life energy of the Necrontyr, the life force bound up with the soul, and that released energy was the food the Citan craved. As millions of Necrontyr entered the soul forges to become deathless, the Citan harvested their life forces and feasted on their souls. The transformation that gave the Necrontyr immortality was the same process that fed the Citan, and the food was the very thing that made the Necrontyr who they were. Their souls, their life energy, the spark of living selfhood that the transformation stripped away and the Citan consumed. The Citan grew enormous in power as they fed, an entire species worth of life energy harvested through the soul forges, poured into the star gods and swelled their power to heights they had never reached before. The beings the Necrontyr had created as weapons grew through the consumption of the Necrontyr's own souls into powers great enough to dominate the galaxy. The Necrontyr were feeding their creators with their own essence, and the more of them passed through the forges, the more powerful the Citan became, and the more diminished the Necrontyr were. What was lost? The side effect of biotransference, the thing that made it a curse disguised as a gift, was that the Necrontyr lost their souls. This is the heart of the tragedy, and it deserves to be stated plainly. The Necrontyr had wanted immortality, an escape from the death that tormented them. They got it. The Necrons that emerged from the soul forges were immortal, their living metal bodies proof against age and radiation, and almost any injury. The deathlessness the Necrontyr had craved made real, but the immortality came at the cost of the soul. The vast majority of the transformed Necrontyr lost the ability to feel emotion, lost their individuality, lost the inner life that made them persons and not mechanisms. They became the soulless, the hollow, immortal bodies animated by a consciousness that had been stripped of everything that made consciousness worth having. Consider what this means. A Necrontyr who passed through the soul forges did not die. Not quite. The consciousness continued, transferred into the new body, the memories and the knowledge preserved. But the soul was gone, consumed by the Citan, and with it the emotions, the individuality, the capacity for joy or grief or love or hope. What remained was a thing that remembered being a person, that could think and act and remember, but could not feel, could not want in the way the living want, could not be a self in the full sense. The Necrontyr had sought to escape death, and had instead achieved a state that was neither life nor death, but a hollow continuation, deathless and empty. The death-obsessed people, who had built their whole culture around the fear of death and the longing to escape it, had escaped death by becoming things that were no longer alive enough to fear it. The cruelty of this is almost too precise. They feared death so greatly that they gave up their souls to escape it, and in giving up their souls, they gave up the very thing that had done the fearing, the living selfhood that made death frightening. They won the war against death by surrendering everything that made the war worth fighting. The immortality was real. The people who had wanted it were gone, replaced by hollow machines that wore their memories. The nobles who remained. Not all of the transformed were stripped entirely. A few retained something, and the exception matters, because it is the thread of personality that carries the Necron story forward through the 60 million years that followed. Only the most powerful nobles retained significant portions of their personality and will. The Pharaons, the overlords, certain lords and cryptex, the highest ranks of Necrontyr nobility, came through biotransference with enough of themselves intact to remain persons in a meaningful sense. They kept their wills, their cunning, their ambitions, their capacity for the schemes and the rivalries and the purposes that had defined the Necrontyr nobility. They were diminished, changed, their emotional range reduced, and their nature altered by the transformation. But they were not hollowed out the way the masses were. they remained someone. This created the Necron society that would persist into the 41st millennium. A vast population of soulless, will-less warriors and workers, animated machines without inner life, ruled by a thin layer of nobles who retained personality and will. The Necron legions that would terrorize the galaxy were, in their masses, mindless, but they were commanded by lords who schemed and planned and pursued their ambitions with the cunning of the Necrontyr nobility preserved through the transformation. The Necrons were not, at the top, mindless. They were ruled by some of the most patient and cunning minds in the galaxy, minds that had survived biotransference and carried the old Necrontyr ambitions into the new immortal existence. But even the nobles had lost something. They had lost their emotional fullness, their connection to the living warmth that had made them persons in the complete sense. They were cold now, calculating, their wills intact but their hearts hollowed. The nobles who ruled the Necrons were not the Necrontyr nobles they had been. They were the cold remnants of those nobles, carrying the ambition and the cunning forward, without the full living selfhood that had once accompanied it. What immortality gave. It would be a mistake to say that biotransference gave the Necrontyr nothing. It gave them precisely what they had asked for, and the exactness of the gift is part of what makes it so terrible. The Necrons that emerged from the Soul Forges were immortal in a way that the Necrontyr could never have imagined. Their living metal bodies could not be eroded by age. The ionizing radiation that had blighted Necrontyr flesh and shortened Necrontyr lives could do nothing to necrodermis. Only the most terrible of injuries could destroy a Necron utterly, and even grievous damage could be repaired, the living metal of their bodies reconstructing itself, the Necron rising again from wounds that would have killed any living thing many times over. The deathlessness was real, complete. Everything the death-obsessed Necrontyr had dreamed of across their whole tormented history. If the price had been steep, biotransference had fulfilled all of the promises that the Citan had made. This is the line the law uses, and it captures the awful exactness of the bargain. The Citan had not lied about what they offered. They had promised immortality, and they had delivered immortality in full, just as promised. Even the lowliest of the Necrontyr was now blessed with deathlessness, the gift extended to the whole species, none excluded, the escape from death made universal. The Citan kept their word in full. The deception was not in the promise, but in the omission. The Citan had said what immortality would give. They had not said what it would cost. The Necrontyr heard the promise of deathlessness and did not hear, because the Citan did not say that the deathlessness would come at the price of the soul. The bargain was honest in its terms and catastrophic in its silence. A gift delivered just as promised, with the price concealed until the receiving made the price irreversible. This is the particular horror of the Citan's bargain. They did not cheat the Necrontyr of the immortality. They gave it in full, and took the soul as the unstated cost, and the Necrontyr could not complain that they had been lied to, only that they had not understood what they were agreeing to. The weapon the galaxy would fear. What emerged from the Soul Forges was not only a tragedy, it was also a weapon, and from the Citan's perspective, and the cold perspective of the war, the transformation had produced just what was needed to win. The Necrons were the perfect soldiers, deathless, tireless, fearless, free of the mortality and the suffering and the short lives that had limited the Necrontyr. They were an army that could not be worn down the way a living army could. They felt no pain, no fear, no reluctance. They did not age, did not sicken, did not break under the psychological pressures that break living soldiers. They were animated by enough consciousness to fight with skill and coordination, and emptied of enough soul to fight without the hesitation or the self-preservation that living beings cannot wholly suppress. An army of the soulless, commanded by cunning nobles, housed in immortal bodies, was a military instrument of terrible effectiveness, and they were led into battle by the C'tan, now swollen with the harvested souls of the Necrontyr, to a power they had never possessed before. The incarnate C'tan, powerful enough to kill stars and burn multiple planets at will, would lead the Necron legions against the Old Ones. The combination was unstoppable. The deathless metal legions below, the star-killing gods above, an army that could not be worn down, commanded by beings that could unmake worlds. This was the force that Biotransference had created. The Necrontyr had been a losing power. The Necrons, with their C'tan masters, were the force that would win the war in heaven and break the Old Ones forever. The tragedy and the weapon were the same thing. The transformation that destroyed the Necrontyr created the Necrons, and the Necrons were both the corpse of a murdered species and the army that would conquer the galaxy. There is no separating the two. The hollow soldiers that would terrorize the Old Ones were the hollowed-out Necrontyr, and the victory they would win was built on the souls of the species that had been consumed to create them. The Silent King learns the price. At the center of the tragedy stands the Silent King, Shattering, the monarch, who had accepted the bargain on behalf of his people, and whose realization of what he had done is one of the most haunting moments in all the lore. The biotransference was already well underway when the Silent King understood the true cost. Millions had passed through the Soul Forges, the transformation moving across the whole species, before the king grasped what was happening in truth, what the C'tan were taking, what his people were losing. By then, it could not be stopped. The process had its own momentum, the C'tan grown powerful on the harvested souls, the transformation rolling forward through the population with the king's own authority behind it. The law preserves the moment of his realization with terrible precision. There was a terrible emptiness gnawing at his mind, an inexpressible hollowness of spirit that defied rational explanation. In that moment, he knew with cold certainty that the price of physical immortality had been the loss of his soul. The Silent King felt the emptiness in himself, the hollow where the soul had been, and understood, too late, what the bargain had cost. He had sought to save his people from the death that tormented them. He had instead destroyed them, traded their souls to the C'tan, transformed the living species into hollow machines, and the realization came only when the emptiness was already inside him, and the transformation was already done. With great sorrow, the Silent King beheld the fate he had brought upon his people. The Necrontyr were now but a memory. The soulless, undying Necrons had been reborn in their place. The king who had ruled the Necrontyr now ruled the Necrons, a deathless people who had been his living subjects and were now hollow machines, transformed by his decision, their souls consumed by the allies he had trusted. The weight of it is in the phrase, with great sorrow. The Silent King had the personality and will to feel the sorrow, retained enough of himself to grieve, and what he grieved was the destruction of his entire species by his own hand. This sorrow would shape everything the Silent King did afterward. The guilt of having destroyed his people, of having sold their souls to the C'tan in a bargain he had not understood, would drive him to the actions that defined the rest of the war. The revolt against the C'tan, the shattering of the star gods, the long attempt to find some way to atone for what he had done. The Silent King's sorrow was the seed of the Necron rebellion. the first stirring of the resistance that would in time break the Citan's power. But that is a later part. For now, the king stood amid the transformation of his people, feeling the emptiness where his soul had been, understanding too late the price of the bargain, grieving a species that he himself had destroyed. Sleep well. Tomorrow the Citan, swollen with the souls of an entire species, turn their full power against the Old Ones, and the second war begins, the one the Necrons would win. The Citan were swollen with the souls of an entire species. The Necrons were a deathless army that could not be worn down, and the war against the Old Ones began again. This was the second phase of the war in heaven, the phase the Necrontyr had been unable to reach in their living form, the phase in which the masters of the galaxy were at last brought down. The first war had been unwinnable. The second war was won. Tonight we sit with the star gods at the height of their power, with the red harvest that fed them, and with the name Citan, whose nature would shape the galaxy's deepest fears for 60 million years. The war begins again. With the Necrons diminished in spirit, but vastly empowered in body, and led into battle by incarnate Citan powerful enough to kill stars and burn multiple planets at will, this new force took the fight back to the Old Ones, and this time it won. The change was total. The first war, fought by the living Necrontyr, had been a war the Necrontyr could not win, because their technology could not overcome the Old Ones' mastery of the warp and the Webway. The second war, fought by the Necrons and the incarnate Citan, was a different war entirely. The deathless legions could not be exhausted. The star-killing Citan could match and exceed the cosmic power the Old Ones commanded. The advantage that had made the Old Ones unbeatable in the first war was no longer enough in the second, because the force arrayed against them now operated on a scale that the Webway and the warp mastery could no longer evade. The Necrons and the Citan forced the Old Ones back on every front, devastating them in battle after battle. The masters of the galaxy, who had held their dominion for an age, who had been beyond the reach of the living Necrontyr, found themselves losing. The deathless legions came on without tiring, and the Citan burned their worlds and killed their stars, and the Old Ones fell back and back and back again, across a galaxy that had been theirs and was becoming a battlefield they were losing. Countless species that the Old Ones had fostered across the galaxy were exterminated. The garden the Old Ones had planted, the worlds of life they had seeded and tended across the long age of their dominion, became feeding grounds for the Citan. The species the Old Ones had made were consumed, their life force greedily devoured by the hungry star gods. The garden of the galaxy harvested for the energy that the Citan craved. The war was not only the defeat of the Old Ones, it was the devastation of everything the Old Ones had built, the unmaking of the garden, the consumption of the galaxy's life by the gods the Necrontyr had created. There is a bitter reversal in this that is worth marking. In the first war, the Old Ones had held every advantage. They were near immortal, masters of the warp, commanders of the Webway, secure in a dominion that the living Necrontyr could not threaten. The Necrontyr had been the desperate ones, the short-lived sufferers fighting an enemy beyond their reach. Now the positions were reversed. The Old Ones were the ones being driven back, being exterminated, facing the real possibility of their own end. And the enemy that had reversed the war was the same enemy, transformed. The Necrontyr, who had become the Necrons, who had been losing and were now winning, who had paid for the reversal with their souls. The first masters of the galaxy were learning what the Necrontyr had known beneath the Scourging star. The experience of facing an enemy you cannot defeat. The slow certainty of an approaching end. The Red Harvests. The Citan hunger had become the organizing purpose of the Necron War, and the hunger expressed itself in the events the lore calls the Red Harvests. The Citan craved the life energy of living things. They had fed on the souls of the Necrontyr through the Soul Forges, and the feeding had made them powerful, and the hunger had grown with the feeding rather than diminishing. Now, with the galaxy's living species spread before them and the deathless Necron legions to do the gathering, the Citan set about feeding on a galactic scale. The Necrons, the soulless slaves of the star gods, were sent to cull the living, to gather sentient beings for the Citan to consume, to harvest the galaxy's life for the gods' endless hunger. These cullings were the Red Harvests. The Necrons, mechanical and tireless and without mercy, descended on the living worlds and gathered their populations for consumption. The Citan fed on the harvested life, growing ever more powerful, their hunger driving the Necrons to ever greater cullings. The galaxy's living species, including the species the Old Ones had made and the countless others that had arisen, became cattle for the star gods, harvested by the deathless legions, consumed to feed a hunger that could not be satisfied. This is the depth of what the Necrontyr had unleashed. They had created the Citan, given them bodies, fed them their own souls, and produced beings whose hunger now drove the systematic consumption of life across the galaxy. The Necrons, who had been the Necrontyr, were the instruments of the harvest, the soulless gatherers culling the living for the gods that had hollowed them out. The species that had wanted only to escape its own suffering had become the means by which suffering was inflicted on the entire galaxy, the harvest of all living things to feed the hunger of the gods they had made. The Red Harvests were the Citan at the height of their power and their tyranny. They had been formless energies in the stars. The Necrontyr had given them bodies. The souls of the Necrontyr had made them strong, and now they ruled the galaxy as devouring gods, served by the deathless remnant of the species that had created them, feeding on the life of a galaxy that had no power to resist the combination of the star-killing star gods and the tireless metal legions. It is worth trying to grasp the scale of this, though the scale resists grasping. This was a war fought across the whole galaxy, by beings that could destroy stars, lasting not years or centuries, but long stretches of deep time. The Citan could burn multiple planets at will. The Necron legions numbered in quantities that the living races could not match. The Old Ones, masters of a galaxy-spanning webway, fought back across the same vast distances. This was not a war of armies meeting on battlefields. It was a war of cosmic powers contending across the galaxy, a war that reshaped the fabric of reality itself, that exterminated entire species and consumed the life of countless worlds and dragged on across a span of time so long that the rise and fall of later empires would be brief events by comparison. The war in heaven earned its name. It was a war of gods, fought on the scale of the galaxy, across the depths of time, and the galaxy of the 41st millennium is the wreckage it left behind. The name gods. The Citan who led this devastation were individuals now, named beings of distinct and terrible character, and the greatest of them deserved to be named, because their natures imprinted themselves on the galaxy in ways that endure into the 41st millennium. The Nightbringer, Azagorod, was perhaps the most terrible in its effect on the galaxy's psyche. The Nightbringer was death given form, and when it moved through the galaxy reaping the living, it imprinted on the consciousness of countless species a primal terror, the universal fear of death, and the image of the robed reaper with the scythe. The lore holds that the reason so many of the galaxy's races, including humanity, share the image of death as a cloaked, skeletal figure with a scythe is that the Nightbringer showed itself to their distant ancestors during the war in heaven, and the terror was burned so deep that it became instinct, passed down through 60 million years as the universal shape of the fear of death. The Nightbringer did not merely kill, it taught the galaxy to fear, and the fear it taught outlived the war by 60 million years. The deceiver, Mephetran, was the most cunning of the Citan, the trickster and manipulator, the schemer whose designs would shape the fate of the star gods themselves. Where the Nightbringer ruled through terror, the deceiver ruled through manipulation, through lies and misdirection, and the patient pursuit of schemes that the other Citan did not see. The deceiver would prove the most enduring of the Citan, the one whose cunning would carry it through the catastrophes that befell the others, and its role in what came later, in the shattering of the Citan and the long aftermath, would be the role of the manipulator working its designs from the shadows. The Void Dragon was perhaps the most powerful of all the Citan, a being associated with machines and technology, whose full power was so great that it would later be a matter of legend and dread. The outsider was the Citan that would be driven mad, isolated, the maddened star god. And there were others, many others, the Citan, who led the Red Harvests and the war against the Old Ones, beings of star-killing power and devouring hunger that ruled the galaxy in the age of their triumph. These were the gods the Necrontyr had made and fed and served. Death incarnate, the great deceiver, the dragon of the void, the maddened outsider, and the rest, ruling the galaxy as devouring tyrants, served by the hollow remnant of their creators, feeding on the life of the galaxy in the red harvests. The Necrontyr had sought an edge to win a war. They had created gods, and the gods had won the war. And now the gods ruled, and the Necrontyr were gone, replaced by the soulless slaves who gathered the harvest. The slaves who could not refuse. There is a particular horror in the role the Necrons played in the Red Harvests, and it is worth sitting with, because it is the deepest cruelty of the whole transformation. The Necrons culled the living for the Citan to eat. They gathered sentient beings, harvested populations, served as the tireless instruments of the gods' hunger. And they did this as slaves, without the will to refuse. The biotransference that had hollowed them out had not only stripped their souls, it had made them the servants of the Citan, bound to the star gods' purposes, the mechanical slaves of the beings that had consumed their souls. The masses of the Necrons, soulless and willless, could not object to what they were made to do. They did it without question, gathering the harvest, culling the living, serving the hunger, with no inner self left to recoil from the horror of the work. Consider the Necrontyr who had been persons, who had wanted to escape their own suffering, who had feared death and longed for a gentler existence. Those persons were gone, and what remained wore their bodies and carried out the systematic consumption of the galaxy's life. The species that had suffered now inflicted suffering on a galactic scale, not by choice, because choice had been taken from them, but by the compulsion of their hollowed nature and the will of the gods they served. They had wanted to escape being victims. They had become the instruments by which the whole galaxy was made victim. And the nobles who retained their will, the pharaohs and overlords and lords who had kept their personalities through biotransference, served too. They had will, but they were still bound to the Citan, still subordinate to the star gods who had grown so powerful on the harvested souls. The nobles could think, could scheme, could resent, but they could not yet resist, because the Citan were too powerful, swollen with the souls of an entire species, beyond the strength of even the willful nobles to challenge. The nobles served in cold resentment, carrying their cunning and their growing hatred forward, waiting for a moment that had not yet come. This is the situation that would in time produce the revolt. The willful nobles, resenting their servitude, watching the Citan devour the galaxy, carried within them the seed of rebellion. But the seed needed time and conditions and a weakening of the Citan that had not yet happened. At the height of the Second War, the nobles served and resented and waited, and the star gods ruled unchallenged over the deathless legions in the harvested galaxy. The Old Ones falling. Against this combination, the Old Ones were losing, and as they lost, they began the desperate measures that would shape the galaxy that came after. The masters of the galaxy, who had held their dominion for an age, were being driven back and destroyed. Their garden was being harvested. Their species were being consumed. The Webway itself, the great network that had bound their dominion together, was becoming a battlefield, its passages contested, its security breached. The Old Ones faced, for the first time in their long history, the real possibility of their own extinction, and the possibility drove them to create the answer that would outlive them. New species, engineered as weapons, made to fight the war the Old Ones were losing. But the creation of the warrior races, the making of the Aeldari and the Krork and the others, is the subject of the next part. For now, what matters is the shape of the war at the height of the Citan's power. The Old Ones falling, the garden burning, the red harvest feeding the star gods, the Necron legions tireless and deathless, and the gods that the Necrontyr had made ruling a galaxy that had no power to resist them. The first masters of the galaxy were being brought down by the beings a dying species had created in desperation, and the galaxy was passing from the age of the Old Ones into the age of the star gods, an age of harvest and hunger and the systematic consumption of all living things. It would not last. The very scale of the Citan's hunger, the very totality of their triumph, would produce the conditions of their downfall, because a hunger that consumes everything must in the end run short of food, and a tyranny that hollows out its own servants must in the end face the cunning of the few servants who retain their will. But at the height of the Second War, none of that was visible. The star gods ruled, the Old Ones fell, the galaxy was harvested, and the silent king, carrying his sorrow and his guilt, watched the gods he had loosed devour the galaxy, and began, in the cold remnant of his hollowed heart, to think about how they might be stopped. The thought was the beginning of everything that would come after. It would take time, and the further catastrophes of the war and the weakening of the Citan, before the thought could become action. But it began here, in the height of the star god's triumph, in the sorrow of the king who had destroyed his people. The most powerful tyranny the galaxy had ever known carried within it, from the height of its power, the seed of its undoing. A king who hated what he had done, ruling slaves who hated what they had become, all of them waiting for the moment when the gods might be weak enough to strike. Sleep well. Tomorrow the Old Ones make their answer, and the Aeldari and the Krork are born to fight a war their makers were losing. Facing extinction, the Old Ones did the thing they had always done best. They made life, but where once they had planted a garden, now they forged weapons, engineering new species not to flourish, but to fight, not to be tended, but to be spent in a war their makers were losing. The Aeldari, the Krork, and the others were born in this desperation, created as soldiers against the Necrons and the Citan. And though they could not save their makers, they would inherit the galaxy their makers left behind. Tonight we sit with the warrior races, the children made for war, and with the fall of the Old Ones, the first masters of the galaxy, hunted at last to extinction by the weapons a dying species had made. The answer to a soulless enemy. The Old Ones faced an enemy with a specific and terrible nature, and their answer to it was shaped by that nature. The Necrons and the C'tan had no presence in the warp. The C'tan were beings of the material universe, drawn from the energy of stars, with no connection to the immaterial dimension. The Necrons were soulless, their souls consumed in the soul forges, hollow in the warp where living things have a presence. The enemy that was destroying the Old Ones was an enemy of the material, an enemy that the warp did not touch. The Old Ones' mastery had always been a mastery of the warp, and so their answer to the soulless enemy was to create species with an overwhelming presence in the warp, beings whose connection to the immaterial dimension was so strong that they could wield psychic power on a scale that might match the material power of the C'tan and the Necrons. If the enemy could not be touched through the warp, the Old Ones would create servants who were so powerful in the warp that they could bring its force to bear in ways the enemy could not counter. The greatest of these creations was the Aeldari. The Old Ones engineered the Aeldari as a species specifically designed to have a strong, fundamental connection to the warp, in order to make them powerful psychers. The Aeldari were built to be the psychic warriors the war required, beings whose souls burned so bright in the warp that they could wield psychic power of tremendous force. The Old Ones' answer to an enemy that had no souls at all. Where the Necrons were hollow, the Aeldari were full, overflowing. Their connection to the warp, the very thing the Old Ones designed them to carry into the war. This design would have consequences that echoed across the next 60 million years, though the Old Ones could not have foreseen them. The intense psychic nature of the Aeldari, the brightness of their souls in the warp, the depth of their connection to the immaterial dimension, was the very thing that would, much later, make them vulnerable to the catastrophe of their own fall, the birth of the chaos god Slaanesh, from the excesses of Aeldari souls. The Old Ones made the Aeldari psychically powerful to fight the soulless Necrons, and the psychic power they gave them was the seed of the Aeldari's own eventual doom. But that doom lay 60 million years in the future. In the war in heaven, the Aeldari were the Old Ones' answer to the soulless enemy, the bright-souled warriors made to fight the Hollow Legions. The Krork and the others. The Aeldari were not the only warrior race the Old Ones created. Facing extinction, they engineered a succession of new species, each intended to help the war effort in its own way. The Krork were the greatest of the others. They were an even bigger, stronger precursor form of the green-skinned, warmongering brutes that humanity would later call Orks. The Krork were built for war in the most direct sense, engineered as powerful warriors, brutal and resilient and made to fight. Where the Aeldari were the psychic answer to the soulless enemy, the Krork were the physical answer, a species of immense martial power created to meet the Necron legions in battle. The Orks of the 41st Millennium, the warlike green-skinned brutes that plagued the galaxy, are the diminished descendants of these Krork, carrying in their nature the war-making purpose the Old Ones built into their ancestors 60 million years ago. There were others, lesser known, the Rashan, the Khanib, species engineered by the Old Ones in their desperation, made to fight the war, named in fragments in the records that survive. And there were creatures whose purpose was less martial, but who were also the Old Ones' work. The Jokero, the strange orangutan-like beings of incredible technological genius, and the Hrood, and others. The various species the Old Ones made or shaped in the long desperation of the war. The creation of these warrior races is one of the most consequential things the Old Ones ever did. More consequential in its way than the war itself, because the war the Old Ones lost, but the species they made survived. The Aeldari, the Krork, the Jokerel, the Hrud, and the others endured the war that killed their makers, and went on to populate the galaxy of the ages that followed. When humanity arose eons later, it arose into a galaxy already full of the descendants of the Old Ones' war children, a galaxy shaped at its foundations by the desperate creativity of a dying species making weapons against the gods it had failed to defeat. There is a question buried in this that connects back to the maker and made relationship from the beginning of this story. The Old Ones had once made species as part of a garden, tending them, fostering them. Now they made species as weapons, to be spent in a war. What did the Old Ones owe to the beings they created for the purpose of fighting and dying in their war? What did those beings owe to the makers who created them as soldiers? The Aeldari and the Krork did not ask to exist, did not choose to be made as weapons, did not consent to be spent in a war that was not theirs. They were created for a purpose, used for that purpose, and outlived the makers who had used them. Whether they were victims of the Old Ones or inheritors of them, whether being made as a weapon is a wrong done to the made or the bare condition of their existence, is a question the lore leaves open, carried forward by the surviving races in their different ways. The Aeldari, above all, would carry a complicated relationship to their origins, a pride and a grief and a sense of inheritance that ran through their whole long history. The Webway War. The war the warrior races were made to fight was, in significant part, a war for the Webway. The Webway was the Old Ones' greatest work, the network that bound their dominion together and made the galaxy small. It was also their refuge and their weapon, the means by which they moved their forces and evaded their enemies and maintained what remained of their power as the war turned against them. And so, the Webway became a battlefield, its passages contested, its gates fought over, the war spilling into the network that had been the foundation of the Old Ones' dominion. The breaching of the Webway was a catastrophe for the Old Ones. The network that had been their secure refuge, the dimension between the material universe and the warp through which they had moved untouchable, was penetrated by their enemies, its passages turned into avenues of attack, its security broken. The Old Ones had used the Webway to fight the First War, evading the Necrontyr through the network that made the galaxy small. In the Second War, the Webway itself was breached, and the advantage it had given was lost, and the Old Ones found their greatest work turned into another front of the war they were losing. The damage done to the Webway in the war would never be repaired in full. The network endures into the 41st millennium, but damaged, fragmented, partially collapsed, haunted by the things that moved into its passages during and after the war. The Aeldari, who would inherit the Webway and make it the foundation of their own civilization, would inherit a damaged thing, a network broken in the war in heaven and never made whole again. The breaching of the Webway was one of the lasting wounds of the war, a damage to the galaxy's deepest infrastructure that 60 million years would not heal. The things that moved into the broken Webway are their own kind of horror and worth a word, a network of passages between the material universe and the warp, damaged and abandoned in places, became a refuge for creatures that should not have had access to it. Predatory entities, lost things, dangers from the warp and from the dark corners of the network took up residence in the abandoned passages. The Aeldari, who would later travel the Webway, would do so with caution, aware that the network they had inherited was not safe, that the war had left it broken and infested, that the passages held not only the routes between the stars, but the things that had moved in when the old ones could no longer keep the network whole. The Webway, the greatest work of the first masters, became after the war a beautiful and dangerous ruin, a monument and a hazard at once, carrying the galaxy's travelers through passages that the war had made perilous. The children who would inherit. There is a particular significance to the Aeldari among the Old One's creations because of what they would become after the war. The Aeldari were made as the psychic answer to the soulless enemy, bright-souled warriors created to bring the force of the warp against the Necrons and the Citan. They fought in the war, and they could not save their makers, but they survived. And in the aftermath of the war, as the Old Ones vanished and the Necrons withdrew, the Aeldari rose. They became the new dominant power of the galaxy, the inheritors of the dominion the Old Ones had lost, the masters of the age that followed the war in heaven. This is one of the great turns of the galaxy's history. The Old Ones made the Aeldari as weapons, tools to be used in the war. The weapons outlived the wielders and inherited the galaxy. The Aeldari took the Webway the Old Ones had built, made it the foundation of their civilization, and rose to a height of power and sophistication that made them, for a long age, the masters of the galaxy in the place of the Old Ones who had made them. The created became the inheritors. The weapons became the new masters. There is a shadow over this inheritance, though, and it connects to the very thing the Old Ones built into the Aeldari. The psychic brightness that made the Aeldari powerful, the connection to the warp that the Old Ones designed into them as their answer to the soulless enemy, was the seed of the Aeldari's own catastrophe. In the long age of their dominion, the Aeldari would indulge their bright souls in excess and pleasure and sensation, and the accumulated psychic weight of their indulgence would, in time, give birth to a new god of chaos, Slanesh, whose birth would devour most of the Aeldari race in an instant, and shatter their dominion as thoroughly as the Old Ones had been shattered. The Old Ones made the Aeldari psychically bright to fight the Necrons. The brightness won them the galaxy, and then destroyed them. The weapon the Old Ones made inherited the galaxy, and then fell, as its makers had fallen, brought down by the very thing that had made it powerful. But that fall lay far in the future, in an age beyond the war in heaven. In the aftermath of the war, the Aeldari rose, inheritors of a galaxy their makers had lost, carrying the Old One's legacy forward into the age that followed the fall of the first masters, the fall of the Old Ones. In the end, despite the warrior races, despite the psychic power of the Aeldari and the martial strength of the Krork, the Old Ones fell. The weapons they had made were not enough. The Aeldari and the Krork and the others fought, and fought well, and could not turn the tide of a war against the empowered Necrons and the incarnate Citan. The Old Ones were driven back on every front, their worlds consumed, their species harvested, their Webway breached, until at last the first masters of the galaxy were hunted almost to extinction by the Citan, the Necrons, and the other horrors the war had unleashed. The Old Ones vanished from the galaxy, hunted to extinction or driven into flight beyond its edge. The dominion that had lasted an age brought to an end. The manner of their ending is uncertain. The lore says they were hunted almost to extinction, or that they fled the galaxy, or both. Different fragments suggesting different fates. Some may have died. Some may have escaped beyond the galaxy's rim, to some refuge the war could not reach. The Slan, the amphibian-like beings thought to be the Old One's closest surviving link, persisted, suggesting that something of the Old Ones endured in some form. But as a power in the galaxy, as the masters who had ruled for an age, the Old Ones were finished. They vanished, and the age of the Old Ones ended, and the galaxy passed out of the hands of its first masters. Consider the magnitude of this. A civilization that had ruled for more than 60 million years, that had mastered the warp and life itself, that had built the Webway and planted the Garden of the Galaxy, was brought to an end. The first masters, the oldest and greatest power the galaxy had produced, were destroyed by the consequences of a single dying species' desperate bargain. The Necrontyr, suffering under their scourging star, had wanted only to escape their own misery, and the chain of choices that flowed from that want, the war, the Sitan, the Biotransference, the Necrons, the Second War, had brought down the masters of the galaxy and ended the age of the Old Ones forever. And yet the Old Ones' true legacy was not their dominion, which ended, but their creations, which endured. The garden they had planted, the species they had made, survived the gardeners. The Aeldari and the Krork and the others, made as weapons in the last desperation of the war, outlived the makers who had spent them. The Old Ones fell, and the galaxy they had made remained, populated by their children, bound by their broken webway, shaped at every level by the work of the first masters. They lost everything except the thing that mattered most, the galaxy itself, which would forever bear the mark of their making, long after the makers were gone. It is worth holding, as we close, the strange shape of what the Old Ones left. They did not leave monuments in the ordinary sense, statues or records, or the things that civilizations usually leave to be remembered by. They left living things. The Aeldari, the Orks, the Jokero, every descendant of every species they made or shaped, is a piece of the Old Ones enduring into the present. They left the Webway, broken but enduring, still carrying travelers between the stars 60 million years after its builders fell. They left a galaxy that is, in its bones, their creation, even though almost nothing remembers them clearly. The first masters vanished, and their legacy is not a memory, but a living galaxy, populated and structured and shaped by hands that are 60 million years gone. Sleep well. Tomorrow the war turns against the victors, the Necrons rise against their star god masters, and a plague from the warp threatens to end all life in the galaxy. The Old Ones were gone, the galaxy was won, and the Khitan ruled as devouring gods over the deathless legions of the Necrons. It was the height of their triumph, and it was the beginning of their end. The very totality of their victory had created the conditions of their downfall, and out of the wreckage of the war came the revolt that broke the star gods, the plague that nearly ended all life, and the long sleep into which the Necrons withdrew to wait out the ruin they had made. Tonight we sit with the turning, the moment the slaves rose against the gods, the shattering of the Sitan, the horror of the enslavers, and the great sleep that closed the war in heaven and set the stage for everything that came after. The hunger with nothing left to eat. The first thing that turned against the Sitan was their own hunger. The star gods fed on the life energy of living things, and they had fed without restraint, consuming the Necrontyr through the soul forges, and then harvesting the galaxy's living species in the red harvests. But a hunger that consumes without limit must in the end face a limit, and the limit was the simple exhaustion of the food. The Old Ones were gone. Countless species had been exterminated. The galaxy that had teemed with life under the Old Ones' tending was being emptied, and the Sitan, having won the war, found the galaxy's living populations diminished to the point where the gods' endless hunger could no longer be satisfied. A complicating horror made this worse. The suffering and destruction the war had unleashed had cascaded through the immaterium, the warp, destabilizing it, and out of the destabilized warp came the enslavers, a plague of psychophagic aliens, warp entities that fed on sentient minds and that erupted into the material universe in a plague that almost destroyed all sentient life. The enslavers were a catastrophe born of the war's own violence, the psychic agony of countless deaths tearing open the boundary between the warp and the material universe and loosing a plague that consumed sentient beings across the galaxy. The enslavers' depredations made the Citan's situation worse. They were consuming the same sentient life the Citan needed, competing for the diminishing supply of living minds, making it impossible for the Necrons to gather enough sentient beings to feed the Citan's ever-growing hunger. The galaxy was being emptied of life from two directions at once, by the Citan's harvests and the enslavers' plague, and the Citan, gods of hunger, faced the prospect of a galaxy with nothing left to eat. This was the crack in the Citan's power. They had won the war and emptied the galaxy, and now their own nature, the endless hunger that defined them, had nothing left to feed on. And the beings best positioned to notice the crack, to understand what it meant and to act on it, were the Necron nobles who had retained their wills through biotransference, the cold, cunning lords who had served the Citan in resentment and waited for a moment of weakness. The Silent King's revolt. The moment had come, and the Silent King took it. Sarek, who had accepted the bargain that destroyed his people, who had felt the emptiness where his soul had been, who had carried his sorrow and his guilt through the long triumph of the gods he had loosed, turned the Necrons against the Citan. With the Old Ones gone, the Silent King turned the Necrons against the Citan themselves. The slaves rose against their masters. The deathless legions that the Citan had used to conquer the galaxy turned on the gods that commanded them, and the revolt that would break the star gods began. The Citan, for all their power, were vulnerable in a way the Necrons understood, because the Necrons had built their bodies in the first place. The Citan were housed in necrodermis, the living metal that the Necrontyr had crafted to contain the formless stellar energies. The Necrons knew that metal, understood it, had made it, and they had a weapon designed for this very purpose, a technology that could break the Citan apart. The star gods, drunk on the life energy they had consumed during biotransference and the Red Harvest, had become tyrannical masters rather than allies, and their arrogance may have left them unprepared for the revolt of the slaves they had hollowed out. The Necrons struck and overpowered the remaining Citan and broke them. There is something fitting in the Silent King being the one to lead the revolt. He was the one who had made the bargain, who had sold his people to the Citan, who carried the guilt of their destruction, and so he was the one who turned them against the gods he had loosed, who led the revolt that broke the star gods, who tried, through the breaking, to undo some part of what he had done. The revolt was his atonement, or the beginning of it, the act of a king trying to make right the catastrophe he had caused. He could not restore the souls the Citan had eaten. He could not bring back the Necrontyr who were gone. But he could break the gods who had taken them, and he did, turning the deathless legions against their masters and shattering the Citan that he himself had given bodies and fed with his people's souls. The king who had made the gods unmade them, the one act of unmaking a partial answer to the catastrophe of the making. The shattering of the gods. The weapon was the Tesseract Labyrinth, and what it did to the Citan is one of the great reversals of the galaxy's history. The Necrons used the advanced technology known as the Tesseract Labyrinth to break the Citan into smaller, less powerful shards of themselves. The gods that had killed stars and harvested the galaxy, that had ruled as devouring tyrants over the deathless legions, were shattered, broken apart into fragments, each fragment a diminished piece of the whole that the Citan had been. The shards were then imprisoned, contained within the pocket-dimensional space of the Tesseract labyrinth. The broken pieces of the star gods locked away by the slaves who had risen against them. These shards became the Citan shards, and they would persist into the 41st millennium as living weapons in the Necrons' arsenal. Mephetron the Deceiver became a shard, his cunning preserved in fragmented form. The Nightbringer became a shard, death incarnate broken into a piece of itself. The Void Dragon, the Outsider, and the rest, the gods that had ruled the galaxy, reduced to shards, imprisoned, used by the Necrons as weapons to be unleashed against their foes, and then contained again. The gods had become tools. The masters had become the possessions of their former slaves. There is a deep justice in this, and a deep horror both. The justice is that the Citan, who had used and hollowed and enslaved the Necrontyr, were in the end used and broken and imprisoned by the Necrons the Necrontyr had become. The beings that had treated an entire species as food and tools were reduced to tools themselves, shattered and contained and deployed at the will of their former slaves. The horror is that nothing was healed by this. The Necrons were still soulless. The Necrontyr was still gone. Breaking the Citan did not restore what the Citan had taken. It was a revenge, not a redemption. The slaves mastering the gods without recovering the souls the gods had eaten. Above all else, the Necron nobility now sought a way to reverse the process of biotransference and restore their organic bodies. This was the deeper purpose behind the revolt, and behind everything the Necrons would do in the ages that followed. They did not want only to break the Citan. They wanted to undo what the Citan had done, to recover the souls and the flesh and the living selfhood that biotransference had stripped away, to become again the living beings they had been before the bargain. Whether this was possible, whether the souls consumed by the Citan could ever be restored, was uncertain. But it became the great project of the Necron nobility, the hope that drove them through the ages, to reverse the transformation and live again. The Citan shards that the Necrons kept are worth understanding, because they represent one of the strangest relationships in the galaxy. A shard is a fragment of a shattered Citan, a piece of a star god, diminished from the whole but still possessed of terrible power. The Necrons keep these shards imprisoned and deploy them as weapons, unleashing a fragment of a god against their foes and then containing it again. But the shards are not safe to keep. They remember being gods. They scheme, in their fragmented way, to be free, to reunite, to regain the power they had before the Shattering. The Deceiver's shard, in particular, carries the cunning of the great manipulator, and works its schemes even in its diminished state. The Necrons hold their broken gods on a leash, using them and fearing them, masters of beings that were once their masters and that have never stopped wanting to be masters again. It is a relationship of permanent tension, the slaves who became jailers keeping their former gods in chains that the gods are forever testing. The galaxy in ruins. The war was over, and the galaxy it left behind was a wreck. The old ones were gone, hunted to extinction or fled. Countless species had been exterminated in the Red Harvests and the Enslaver Plague. The Citan were shattered into shards. The Webway was broken. The Necrons had won, and then had broken their own masters, and stood at the end of the war as the victors of a galaxy that had been devastated beyond recognition. The garden the Old Ones had planted was a ruin, the galaxy emptied of much of its life, the great works of the First Age broken or abandoned, and the Aeldari were rising. The species the Old Ones had made as weapons, having survived the war, were spreading into the emptied galaxy, becoming the new power, the inheritors of a dominion the Old Ones had lost. The galaxy that the Necrons had won was already being claimed by others, the bright-souled children of the Old Ones rising to fill the vacuum that the war had created. The Necrons had won the war and found the prize already slipping into other hands. The enslaver plague still raged, the psychophagic horror born of the war's violence consuming sentient life across the galaxy. The Necrons, victorious but devastated, their civilization in ruins, faced a galaxy that was emptied, plagued, and being claimed by the rising Aeldari. They had won everything and inherited nothing but ruin. The triumph of the Revolt, the shattering of the Citan, had come at the end of a war that had destroyed the very galaxy the Necrons might have ruled. The enslavers deserve a moment of their own, because they are one of the war's most terrible and least understood consequences. They were not created by anyone. They were a product of the war itself, of the sheer quantity of death and suffering the war had produced. In the Warhammer 40,000 universe, emotion and suffering and death are not only events in the material world, they register in the warp, and enough of them can tear the boundary between the warp and the material universe. The war in heaven, with its exterminations and its harvests and its countless deaths, had produced suffering so vast that it destabilized the immaterium, and the enslavers boiled out of the wound. They were warp predators that fed on sentient minds, that could possess and consume the sentient, that erupted across the galaxy in a plague that threatened to end all sentient life. The war had not only killed in the open, it had wounded reality itself, and out of the wound came a plague that nearly finished what the war had started. This is a pattern that the galaxy would see again, in the fall of the Aeldari and the birth of Slaanesh, in the opening of the Eye of Terror, in every catastrophe where suffering on a vast scale tore the boundary and loosed horrors from the warp. The enslaver plague was the first great instance of it, the war's violence rebounding from the warp to nearly destroy the galaxy a second time. The Great Sleep. And so, the Silent King made his final decision, the one that would define the Necrons until the 41st millennium. He ordered the Great Sleep, their civilization left in ruins by the war in heaven and their revolt against the Citan. The Necrons chose to enter hibernation on thousands of tomb worlds scattered across the stars, where they would sleep in stasis tombs for tens of millions of years. The Silent King ordered the Great Sleep, and the Necrons retreated to their tomb worlds and entered stasis for 60 million years, waiting for the galaxy to calm and the lesser races to weaken before reclaiming their dominion. The logic of the Great Sleep was patient and cold, the logic of immortal beings who could afford to wait. The galaxy was a ruin, plagued by enslavers, being claimed by the rising Aeldari. The Necrons could not rule it as it was, so they would sleep, withdraw into their tomb worlds, wait out the plague and the chaos and the rise and fall of the lesser races, and wake when the galaxy had calmed and the time was right to reclaim what they had won. Immortal beings do not need to seize the moment. They can wait for a better one, across spans of time that would exhaust any mortal patience. And so, the death-obsessed people, who had become the deathless Necrons, who had built their whole ancient culture around tombs and mortality, laid themselves down in the greatest tombs of all, the tomb worlds, and slept. The funerary culture reached its final fulfillment. The people who had always built tombs built the greatest tombs in the galaxy's history and entered them, deathless and soulless, to sleep through 60 million years while the galaxy they had ruined healed and changed and forgot them. The Silent King did not sleep with them. Burdened by his guilt, he exiled himself from the galaxy, departing into the intergalactic void to atone for what he had done to his people, leaving the sleeping Necrons in their tombs. The king, who had destroyed his species by his bargain, who had freed them by his revolt, removed himself from the galaxy entirely, carrying his sorrow into the dark between the galaxies, while his people slept in their tombs, and the galaxy passed into the age of the Aeldari and, far later, of humanity. The war in heaven was over. 60 million years of silence began. Think of the silence that settled over the galaxy. The gods were broken and imprisoned. The slaves were sleeping in their tombs. The king had exiled himself into the dark between the galaxies. The first masters were gone. And across the galaxy, on thousands of tomb worlds, the Necrons lay in their stasis tombs, deathless and dreamless, while the galaxy above them passed through age after age. The Aeldari rose and built their dominion and fell in their turn. New powers came and went. Humanity arose on a small world and spread among the stars. And beneath all of it, through all of it, the Necrons slept, the wreckage of the oldest war lying quiet in the tombs, waiting for the moment to wake. 60 million years of silence, the longest sleep in the galaxy's history, the dead war resting beneath the living galaxy that had grown up over its grave. Sleep well. Tomorrow, in the final part, we gather what the war made and follow its long shadow into the galaxy of the 41st millennium, where the sleepers begin to wake. 60 million years is the span we have to cross now, from the end of the war in heaven, with the Necrons sleeping in their tombs and the gods broken into shards and the Silent King exiled into the void, to the galaxy of the 41st millennium, where humanity fights for survival and the ancient sleepers begin to stir. The war is 60 million years gone. Its shadow has never lifted. Almost everything that defines the galaxy of the present can be traced back to the war that the Old Ones lost, and the Necrontyr did not survive. Tonight, in this final part, we gather what the war in heaven made, and follow its long shadow forward to the moment the sleepers wake. Why the galaxy is what it is. Almost every major feature of the 41st Millennium galaxy descends from the war in heaven, and gathering these connections is the best way to understand the war's importance. The Aeldari exist because of the war. They were created by the Old Ones as psychic weapons against the Necrons and the Citan. Their entire nature, their overwhelming connection to the warp, the brightness of their souls, was engineered for the war, and the fall of the Aeldari, the catastrophe that birthed the Chaos God Slanesh and shattered their dominion, flowed from that same engineered psychic nature. The Aeldari of the 41st millennium, the dying remnant of a once great race, are the descendants of a weapon the Old Ones made 60 million years ago, carrying the consequences of their creation through every age since. The Orks exist because of the war. They are the descendants of the Krork, the warrior race the Old Ones engineered for martial power. The Orks of the 41st millennium, the warlike green tide that plagues the galaxy, carry in their nature the war-making purpose the Old Ones built into their ancestors. Their instinctive drive to fight, their fungal resilience, their whole nature as a species made for war, descends from the Old Ones' desperate engineering during the war in heaven. The Necrons exist because of the war, obviously, since the war is the story of their creation. The Necrons of the 41st Millennium, the deathless dynasties waking from their tombs, are the Necrontyr transformed, the survivors of Biotransference, carrying the memory of the Scourging star and the bargain and the betrayal across 60 million years of sleep. Everything the Necrons are, their deathlessness, their soullessness, their cold cunning, their hatred of the Citan, their longing to live again, descends from the war in heaven. The Citan shards exist because of the war, the broken fragments of the star gods, imprisoned and deployed by the Necrons. The Webway exists because of the war, the broken network the Old Ones built, inherited and used by the Aeldari and others. The very shape of the Immaterium, scarred by the suffering of the war, owes something to the catastrophe. The universal fear of death, the image of the Reaper, was burned into the galaxy species by the Nightbringer during the war. Again and again, the features of the present galaxy trace back to the war 60 million years gone. The pattern the war set. Beyond the specific connections, the war in heaven set a pattern that the galaxy would repeat, and recognizing the pattern is part of understanding why the war matters. The pattern is this: a species, seeking to escape suffering or to gain power, makes a bargain or a choice that gives it what it wants and destroys it in the process. The Necrontyr wanted to escape death. They got immortality and lost their souls. The Aeldari, later, wanted pleasure and sensation and the full indulgence of their bright nature. They received it, and the accumulated weight of it birthed Slanesh and devoured their race. The pattern recurs, the thing desired, granted, and the granting becoming the destruction. The war in heaven set the template, the Necrontyr the first to walk the road of receiving precisely what they wanted and being unmade by the getting. The pattern extends to the relationship between makers and the things they make. The Old Ones made the Citan into gods by giving them bodies, and the gods turned on the galaxy. The Necrontyr made the Citan strong by feeding them their souls, and the Citan enslaved them. The Old Ones made the Aeldari as weapons, and the weapons inherited the galaxy and then fell. Again and again in the war in heaven, the act of making produces something that escapes and turns and destroys, the maker undone by the made. It is a pattern the galaxy would see again, in the making of the Primarchs and the Space Marines, in every creation that turned against its creator, and the war in heaven set it first. There is a deep pessimism in the pattern, and it is part of what gives the Warhammer 40,000 universe its particular darkness. The lesson of the war in heaven, if it has a lesson, is that the pursuit of escape from suffering tends to produce greater suffering, that the things we make to save us tend to destroy us, that getting what you want is often the worst thing that can happen. The Necrontyr wanted only to stop dying. The want was understandable, even sympathetic, and it led to the destruction of their species, the devastation of the galaxy, and 60 million years of consequences. The war in heaven is the galaxy's first and deepest demonstration of the principle that defines the setting, that in this universe, there is no escape that does not cost more than the suffering it escapes. The sleepers wake. For 60 million years the Necrons slept, and then, in the time of the 41st Millennium, they began to wake. The great sleep had been meant to last until the galaxy calmed, and the lesser races weakened, until the time was right for the Necrons to reclaim their dominion. The waking was not clean. Some tomb worlds woke on schedule, their dynasties rising in good order, their nobles intact, ready to reclaim what they remembered. Others woke damaged, their stasis systems having failed across the immense span of time, their sleepers degraded, their dynasties rising as broken and malfunctioning things. the long sleep having gone wrong in ways that left the waking Necrons less than they had been. 60 million years is a long time even for stasis technology, and not all the sleepers came through it whole. The galaxy they woke into was not the galaxy they had left. The Aeldari had risen and fallen. Humanity had risen and built an imperium across 1 million worlds. New powers contested the galaxy. New horrors had emerged. The warp had grown more turbulent and chaos more present than in the age of the war. The Necrons woke into a galaxy crowded with the descendants of the species the Old Ones had made, and with humanity, the newcomers, and with the powers of chaos that had grown across the ages. They woke to reclaim a dominion and found the galaxy full of others who would contest it. And the Silent King returned. Zarek, who had exiled himself into the intergalactic void to atone for what he had done, came back to the galaxy in its hour of need, drawn back by a threat that endangered not only the Necrons but all life. The Tyranids, the great devourers from beyond the galaxy, whose hunger recalled the hunger of the Citan and threatened to consume everything. The Silent King, who had destroyed his people and freed them and exiled himself in grief, returned to lead them again, his long penance interrupted by a threat that required the king to come home. There is a terrible echo in the threat that brought Zarek back. The Tyranids are a hunger from beyond the galaxy, a tide of devouring life that consumes everything in its path, that strips worlds of all biomass and moves on. The Citan had been a hunger too, gods that fed on the life of the galaxy, that harvested sentient beings to feed an appetite that could not be satisfied. Zarek had fought one great hunger 60 million years ago, the hunger of the gods he had loosed, and now he returned to fight another, the hunger of the Tyranids. The king, who had once fed his people to a hunger, who had spent 60 million years atoning for it, came back to stand against a new hunger that threatened to consume the galaxy. The penance continues, in a way, the king who had caused one catastrophe of hunger returning to oppose another, as if the only atonement available to him was to keep standing against the thing he had once served. The waking of the Necrons is the war in heaven returning to the galaxy. For 60 million years the oldest war had slept, its combatants in their tombs, its gods in their shards, its king in the void. Now the sleepers wake, the king returns, the shards stir, and the oldest war begins to move again in a galaxy that had forgotten it. The Necrons of the 41st Millennium are not a new power. They are the oldest power, waking from the longest sleep, bringing the war in heaven forward into the present, the ancient catastrophe stirring beneath the walls of the younger races, who do not remember what sleeps beneath them. The hidden hand in human history. There is one more thread of the war's shadow worth following, because it reaches into the story of humanity itself. The question of whether the Old Ones had any hand in the development of humanity is one the lore leaves open, a possibility raised and never resolved. But there are hints of the war in heaven's reach into human affairs that are more concrete. The Void Dragon, the most powerful of the Citan, is believed by some to lie dormant beneath the surface of Mars, the red planet that became the home of the Adeptus Mechanicus, the tech priests who worshipped the machine god. The lore suggests that the machine god the tech priests revere may be the slumbering Void Dragon itself, a shard of a Citan worshipped by the priesthood that maintains the Imperium's technology, the ancient star god of machines lying beneath the rust-red sands, while a whole religion grows up around it, without knowing what it venerates. If this is so, then the war in heaven reaches into the very heart of the Imperium, into the Mechanicus that keeps humanity's technology running, into the religion of Mars itself. The tech priests who pray to the machine god may be praying to a fragment of the Necrontyr's broken gods, a piece of the Citan that ruled the galaxy 60 million years ago, sleeping beneath their holy planet. The shadow of the oldest war falls even here, in the faith of the priesthood that maintains the engines of the Imperium, a hidden Citan at the center of human technological worship. This is the depth of the war's reach. It is not only that the Aeldari and the Orks and the Necrons descend from it, it is that the very foundations of the present galaxy, down to the religion of Mars and the possible origins of humanity itself, may rest on the buried consequences of the war in heaven. The war is not a distant prologue, separate from the present. It is the bedrock the present is built on, its broken gods and its made races, and its ancient catastrophes lying beneath everything, occasionally stirring, never wholly gone. What the war was. The war in heaven was the galaxy's first great war, the war that ended the age of the first masters and set the terms of every age that followed. It was a war fought across the whole galaxy, across spans of deep time, by powers that could kill stars and shape life and break gods. And at its center, beneath all the cosmic scale, was a small and human-feeling tragedy, a suffering people who wanted only to stop dying, and who, in the pursuit of that want, destroyed themselves and devastated the galaxy. That is the thing to hold from the whole long story. The war in heaven is vast, cosmic, ancient beyond comprehension, but its engine was something small and recognizable. The Necrontyr suffered and feared death and wanted to escape it. Everything else, the Citan, the Biotransference, the Necrons, the Red Harvests, the fall of the Old Ones, the Enslaver Plague, the shattering of the gods, the 60 million years of sleep, flowed from that one understandable want. A people did not want to die, and the galaxy still carries the consequences 60 million years later. The Old Ones, the first masters, gardeners of the galaxy, makers of life, fell because of it. The Citan, gods of star and hunger, rose and ruled and were broken because of it. The Aeldari and the Orks and the other races exist because of it. The Necrons sleep and wake because of it. The whole galaxy of the 41st millennium, every war and every horror and every desperate struggle for survival, rests on the foundation of the war that the Necrontyr began because they did not want to die. There is no comfort in the war in heaven, no triumph, no redemption. The Old Ones did not win. The Necrontyr were destroyed. The Citan were broken, but not undone. The Silent King's revolt was a revenge, not a restoration. No one got what they wanted in a way that lasted. The Old Ones lost their dominion. The Necrontyr lost their souls. The Citan lost their freedom. And the galaxy inherited the wreckage, 60 million years of consequences flowing from a war that nobody won. And yet the galaxy endures. Broken, haunted, full of the consequences of the ancient war, the galaxy goes on. The descendants of the Old One's creation still live. The Webway still carries travelers through its broken passages. The Necrons wake to walk the galaxy again. The story did not end with the war in heaven. It began there. Everything since has been the long working out of what the first war set in motion. The shadow of the oldest conflict stretching across 60 million years to touch every corner of the present. It is a strange thing to sit with, in the quiet, at the end of this long telling, that a galaxy so full of life and war and striving rests on a foundation of such ancient sorrow, that the Aeldari dancing on their craft worlds, the Orks roaring across their battlefields, the humans praying in their cathedrals, the Necrons waking in their tombs, all of them move through a galaxy shaped by a war none of them remember, made by makers none of them knew, carrying consequences none of them chose. The war in heaven is the silence beneath all the noise of the present, the old grief beneath the new strivings, the foundation that nobody sees because it lies so deep and so far back, and it is still there, still shaping everything, still stirring as the sleepers wake. This has been the entire war in heaven timeline, from the old ones in their long peace, tending the garden of the galaxy, to the Necrontyr beneath their scourging star, to the Citan found in the dark, to the soul forges and the death of a species, to the red harvest and the fall of the first masters, to the revolt and the shattering of the gods, to the great sleep and the sleepers who wake. The oldest war, the deepest shadow, the foundation beneath everything the galaxy became, told slowly, for the quiet between waking and whatever waits in the dark. Good night, my dear friend.